Hi, and welcome to your first animation in 3ds Max. This is a course for the University of Delaware, Art 265, Core 3D Modeling taught by Marianna Williams. So first things first, we're just going to open up the classic or default workspace. And today I'm just going to show you a little bit about how we're going to navigate the program, different parts of the views. We're going to create some standard geometry, do a little bit of scripting, and show you how to take those animation frames, set up a camera, and export that, and then clean it all up in After Effects. So just to get started, on the right, you see you have standard primitives, the box, sphere, cylinder, torus, teapot area. That's going to be the geometry we're going to work with. But before we get started, we really just want to set up our folders so that when we do create our work, there's somewhere for it to go. So I'm using 2016. I'm going to set my project folder using the 3ds dropdown, going to Manage, and then setting the project folder. In the 2018 version, you're just going to go directly to File, then Set Project Folder. So a little bit of a difference in the layout, but the function is exactly the same. So this project folder itself is going to contain all of the files for my scene. It's going to contain maybe anything I download off of the internet, any photos I have, any custom textures, and we'll get a little bit more into that as we go throughout the course. So just going to set that folder now. Okay, so I've clicked on the Set Project Folder icon or button, and you can see it brings up my computer, my hard drive that I've plugged in. I have a lot of files on here, and I'm kind of a folder nut, so please excuse that, but I'm just going to find something on my expansion drive or on my external hard drive for the purposes of this class. I've already set up a folder in fall 2017, Art 265, Core 3D Modeling, and then I've set up a subfolder within that for these MVP projects. It's a minimally viable project. That's what MVP is standing for here. But I've set this project folder already in 3ds Max, and so it's created subfolders within my original folder. But just to illustrate what I've done, you might want to create a new folder. Called the MVP Demo 2 and hit OK. So if I go in and I look at my folder on my desktop, I can go into my expansion drive, go into the teaching folder, go into the fall 2017 Core 3D Modeling, and now when I click on MVP Demo 2, I can see that 3ds Max has set up all of these folders within it. It's set the project folder as MVP Demo 2. So now anytime I save a scene, it's going to be saved to the scenes portion of that. And when I render something, those files are going to go into render output. And then I can save multiple versions of my scene. I can save my downloads. It's a really useful thing. Saves us a lot of headache because we do want to keep all of these files together. Okay, so back in 3ds Max, and let's save the scene. Let's go ahead and make sure that that project folder is working correctly. So I'm going to go into my drop-down, go to Save, or I can use that icon, the little chip icon there. Go to Save. It already brings up my scenes. You can see that the file path is in my drive, my external drive. It's heading to fall 2017, Art 265 Core 3D Modeling, and then that project folder that I set. So I'm just going to go ahead and save my scene as MVP Scene 1, and that's being saved, as you can see, within the scenes portion of my project folder. I always like to save my files with a date because, and sometimes even the time, or September 6th A, September 6th B. Maybe saving periodically every hour or so, because you never know when a file could get corrupted, or if you if you make a mistake and you need to go back to a legacy version. So just saving that file, and now we're good to start some geometry. Okay, Okay, so let's learn a little bit about the workspace we've got here. In 2018, you see where my mouse is hovering right here on my screen. You're going to be able to change your workspace. You should see an icon. It's like a box, or it could be a series of 4 boxes. I'm using 2016 at the moment, so it's a little bit different on my screen, but by clicking those boxes, you're going to be able to select between a 4-panel view or a big view. The 4-panel view is really useful for modeling, making sure things are oriented correctly in your scene. The big view is great for animation, looking at your lighting and your textures, getting a little bit closer look at those details. I tend to work primarily in the larger view, and I use my hotkeys to switch between that, but really do what's comfortable for you. One way to, other than hotkeys, to switch between it is to actually click on that perspective, and you can click other views. So now I'm seeing the top view. If I click on top and then again on front, I'm seeing that. And actually my default here, if you look to the right of that, is a shaded view. So we'll get into a little bit more of that. So you see, I'm sort of toggling around the screen by holding down my middle scroll wheel and pressing Alt. Let me just insert a teapot or some geometry in here to give you a better idea of how this is working and how things are working spatially in the program. Okay, so I'm just going to click on that teapot button, and you see that underneath in the parameters just below in this drop down, there's a checkbox for body, handle, spout. There's a radius that I can assign to the teapot. Segments is the amount of how many times that teapot is cut into a grid. So the more segments, that's going to be a lot more geometry, but it's also harder to model that at first. So what I would recommend is starting with the least amount of segments you need to create your model, and then adding detail. So we want to start in large passes and then moving up from that. So this is the geometry and sort of your gear toolbar. You have standard primitives. That's going to be your basic boxes, spheres. Everything is pretty basic except the teapot. Extended primitives, that's objects which take more than one click to build. Compound objects, that's booleans, particle systems. We're going to get into that as we move on throughout the semester, but for now, just worry about standard primitives. It's going to be your basic shapes. All right. Okay, so I click the teapot icon, and I've clicked once into my perspective window. I drag and click again to release that object. So I'm dragging to scale, and I click again to release it. Okay? So now we have a teapot in the scene. To zoom in and out of the screen, you're just going to scroll in and out with your middle mouse scroll wheel. Just give you an option of ways to move around the screen. Alright, now to pan back and forth horizontally across the screen, we actually want to hold that middle scroll wheel down and move the mouse from side to side. So let's just try that. See that hand shows up? I'm holding the middle mouse button down and moving that object from side to side. So scrolling in and out as though you're rolling down a web page, that zooms in and out. And then holding that middle mouse button down actually pans the object back and forth. These are just ways to move around the view, move around the screen, and remember that holding the middle mouse button down and the Alt key or the Option key is going to allow you to toggle that world space around. It's more like you're rolling around. So right here I'm just holding down the Alt key and the middle mouse button and dragging my cursor around throughout that window to, see different angles of that teapot that I've got going there. Okay, so I'm just going to create a plane the same way that I created the teapot. I've selected plane in my geometry object type, and I've hit T for top. So that hotkey has brought me to the top view. I click and drag again to create a plane, and then I just hit Q Q is a selection and deselection hotkey. It's sort of like the V in Illustrator or in many Adobe programs, but for 3ds Max we're just going to use Q. And let's look at a way to start to scale some objects and start to build more of an animation. So hitting Q to get that selection tool. And then that corner, that top corner, I was just sort of moving my mouse around over. It really bugs me because it's sort of breaking the third wall. I see that corner in the frame of my animation, and I want to extend this plane so that I no longer see that there. So let's do that now. So there's other hotkeys for scaling, moving, and rotating objects. R is going to be the scaling hotkey. And I hit R on my keyboard, and you see that there's a Z, X, and a Y in this sort of pyramid triangle thing. You can scale objects in the Z direction, the Z axis, the X or the Y, or you can scale them uniformly by holding your mouse in the center of that that sort of pyramid and scaling it out. But for now, I'm just going to click and drag, like what you saw with on the X-axis. And then I'm just going to hit Q to get out of that function. So, okay, awesome. So let's say this is a view that I really like. I want to save it for animating later, but I also want to do some more things to my scene. So one great way to do that is to create a camera within the scene that will save this view so that when you go back to render, you can, select this view again. And it also allows you to go back to your perspective view to work and continue to build the scene. So I'm just going to do that right now by going to Create, and I'm going to go to all the way down to Cameras, and I'm going to create a physical camera from view. The Hotkey is Control-C. The reason why I'm creating a physical camera rather than a free camera, a target camera, or another physical camera is because creating it from the view is going to give me this exact vantage point. That's great because I already know what it's going to look like. And a physical camera is great because a physical camera has a target that I can also move, and that just gives us a little bit more control. You'll see in a little bit why we're choosing that physical camera. So you see here in my viewport, physical camera 1 is now highlighted. I can view that camera by going into Cameras, Physical Camera 1, just to check that it's there. I can also switch back to perspective by clicking, and you see there's this blue sort of field of vision that's been created by the camera. I'm in perspective view, so I scroll out using my middle scroll. You can see that camera that's been created here, and you can also see this is the range of vision that camera has. I can just click outside of that field of vision. Hold on, and it gets rid of that sort of that I guess that window, but it's still there. You can just reselect the camera again, and it'll reappear, so you can always see how things are moving. Okay, great. So I've clicked out using Q. I'm toggling around with the middle mouse and the Alt key, holding those together. And I'm just going to get into just switching back and forth again just to show you, hey, if I want to get back to that camera view. If you have one camera in the scene, you can just hit the C key, that hotkey, and C will actually take you to camera view. You can also go to click on perspective, go into cameras, and you can select that physical camera right there. You don't want to model in your camera view because if you do anything, say you move the scene, that's going to change your camera. So best practice is to set up your camera, quickly hit P for perspective or T for top, one of those other hotkeys for another view for your workspace. And then when you're ready to render or you're ready to check something, switch into C or camera view and then move forward with your rendering. But be very careful not to confuse the perspective view and the camera view. I've done it a million times, and it's really terrible when you find you have just the right angle and then you lose it. So, okay, so just how I can switch between viewports, I can also switch between the way that I'm seeing my models within my viewport. Sometimes it's helpful to work in a wireframe mode to see, hey, how many segments are in this? How's the animation working? Maybe you want to create a quick wireframe animation just to see how motion is happening if your animation is very complex. But 3ds Max 2016 up through 2018 has a number of ways to show objects in the scene depending on the style that you're interested in. For now, just go with shaded or edged faces. That's going to be the simplest way because we just want to focus first on the geometry and the motion, and then we can get into some style. Okay, so I'm going to add some more objects to the scene. I'm just clicking the box icon to create a box, clicking the scene once, dragging, clicking again to establish the width, and then again to establish the height of this box. So very intuitive way to create objects. I don't know if anyone's ever worked in Rhino, but completely painterly 3ds Max. I'm using the W key to move things around, E to toggle and rotate that box around, and in the x-axis, y-axis. And if at any point I find that, oh my gosh, I shouldn't have rotated like that, you can just hit Control-Z to undo, or Control-Y to redo. So I've used Control-Z to the point where I no longer have the box, so now Control-Y to make that box come back. So really useful to be able to go back and forth here. Okay, so just like I scaled the teapot with the R key, I'm going to uniformly scale the box, make it a little bit larger. I just click on that center of the pyramid till it's highlighted, and I just drag upwards to scale upwards. So it's a lot of clicking and dragging. That's pretty good. Okay, so I've scaled my box, and now I'm just going to switch back into camera view the old school way by going into perspective, then cameras, then physical camera 1, just to show what that looks like with the box in the scene. I can also hit the hotkey C to get into that camera. Okay, so I just want to go into a little bit about scripting. This is not a scripting heavy course, but scripting is a very powerful tool in 3ds Max that will allow you to maximize your time and really generate a lot of geometry or modify objects, generate motion, generate textures, you name it. It's basically a tool that you can work with, and you can design and build your own scripts as well. So if you're interested in that, get in touch with me and we can pursue more of that, throughout the course. But for now, I've written out a couple of scripts here, 4 scripts that we can use within this demo. An array is the first. Okay, so to start working in scripts, we need to go into scripting, and within the scripting, we need to open both the Max script listener, which is also F11, and the Max script editor. So the listener is really useful because it's going to tell us what's happening when we execute a script with Max script. We don't otherwise need to do anything with the listener. It's simply receiving information and feeding it back to us. The editor is where we're going to control the script, and where that script is going to sort of act as a function that will control the objects in our scene that we have selected. So to use a script on an object, you first have to have the object selected using Q and just clicking on that object. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, show me the money. So show $ is, and then if I hit Control E to execute that script, that's going to show me all of the attributes about this object that we're going to try to create an array of. Okay, so I'm just using Control and E at the same time with that after I've typed in show the money, and that's gonna, once I type that in, my MacScript listener is gonna show me that, okay, height, length, width, all of these attributes here, these are what can be controlled by a script. It's getting information about that object. Okay, so we know that I can find out information about objects. I could also select another object like the teapot, hit Control E again in the MacScript editor, and it's going to show me different things that the teapot has than the box. Just good to know, because sometimes if you are designing your own scripts and you're wondering why something's not working or why it is working, it could be that the object itself doesn't have the capabilities to be edited. So, maybe a sphere has different properties than a box. Okay, but for our intents and purposes, let's simply copy and paste this array script that I've written for you into the MacScript editor. So for I equals 1 to 25, that's for 1 to 25 objects, I want the MacScript editor to do what's in my parentheses. So I want it to create 1 to 25 objects and place them in an X, Y, and Z coordinate that's random, and which is within 0 to 100 units of my original object. So this script works if you don't totally follow that. It'll still work. It's still a useful tool. But just want to give you a little bit of context as to how this is designed. So I want it to copy my $sign into those positions, those random 0 to 100 units. And that's a position X, position Y, and position Z. So random in the X direction, 0 in the Y direction, and 100 in the Z direction for some of those. So I just hit Control E again to execute that script. And you see I've got all of these boxes, these 25 boxes that have just appeared. And they're really too close together. Like, it's not the effect I wanted. Just looks crazy. So what I can do is I can just use a Command Z to get rid of those. And let's go back in and edit some of these parameters and see how the script is working. Maybe I don't want 25 boxes. Maybe I want fewer. Maybe, I want them to be 50 units away and say 600 units in the X direction from that original box. Say I want them randomly placed between, 70 and 600 in the Y direction. If I edit the Z direction, they'll start to float up and down. So hit Control E again, and now I see, okay, my boxes have spread out a bit more. It's a little bit different from the first. So you're starting to see, like, even if I don't fully understand how to design a script, I can still change the functionality of that script. So hit Command Z again. I'm changing it now to only 15 boxes, and I'm going to space them a little bit closer together. So instead of 600, we're only changing the placement of these by 300 units. And I'm going to hit Control E again to execute that script. Okay, awesome. So now I have a bunch of boxes. That looks more like what I was going for, or for all intents and purposes, time to move on. So holding on the middle mouse button and the Alt key to scroll around, toggle around that screen. And I want to actually select all of these boxes and maybe apply another script to them. So let's go ahead and look at different ways to select an object. If you go up here, these are the selection region options for your cursor. So you can control this by just pressing Q and clicking within your window and dragging over things. So you basically create a window. So we've got the paintbrush select, or the spray can selection. I like the rectangular selection region. Maybe I worked with grids too much in my life. I don't know. Keeps it easy. And I'm just going to click within my perspective viewport, drag, and then release that. And that's going to allow me to select this entire range of boxes that I've created. Now, if you see in the left, when I selected those objects in my scene, they're also being selected in this sort of text line here. So it's saying, okay, I can control objects individually by either selecting and clicking them by their name, or by selecting them and clicking them by what they appear as within their geometry. Okay, I can also rename objects by right-clicking them, hitting rename, and then typing in another name. That's really useful for animations where you have a lot of things going on in your scene and you're not sure exactly, let's say, plane 1, we need to maybe just call that the ground, because maybe there's another plane that's acting as the sky, or maybe you have 50 boxes, but they're all texture mapped different ways. Maybe it's good to know exactly what those are called. Okay, great. So I'm just going to select all those boxes, and now I'm going to use the random height script. So same thing, I'm just going to copy and paste, making sure I get those parentheses in there as well. And I'm going to put that into my script editor. So for the object in the money, that's my boxes. Within the parentheses, this is what I want the script to do. So I want it to assign a random height between 1 and 10. The object.height equals the height. And I hit Control E to execute. So already you see that my boxes have changed scale according to those parameters. I just hit Command Z to undo that. I want them a little bit taller, so let's try a random height between 25 and 100 for every box that's selected. Okay, not too bad. That's a little bit more like what I'm looking for. I can live with that. Okay, so let's get into some animation now. And let's use the script alongside that animation. So if you see where my cursor is, this is the timeline in 3ds Max. You can see that I'm scrolling by holding down. I'm moving from frame 0 to frame 100, and that little yellow box is showing me where I'm at within the timeline. So I'm on frame 0 now, and what I can do, there's a couple different ways to create keyframes, or they're like placeholders for where different bits of motion are happening in the scene. That's what's going to generate your animation. It's almost like it is the same principles as a frame-by-frame animation, but the program itself does a lot of work for you. So we'll just start by selecting Auto Keyframe. Now, you know that it's on because that red window has appeared. And now everything I do, if I move something in the scene with Auto Keyframe selected on a certain frame, it's going to automatically memorize that and assign that placement to the object. So it's basically going to create keyframes for me. So let's explore this now. I'm just going to drag that sort of scroll bar up to the 10th keyframe, 10 of 100. And I'm going to go back into my script editor, hit Control E, and execute the script again. Now Auto Keyframe is on, so it's remembering that original placement at frame 0 and the action that's happened at frame 10. You can see those keyframes, they're indicated by those black boxes there. I'm going to drag it up to 20, click again into my Mac script editor, hit Control E, and I'm just going to continue to repeat that process along the timeline, and I'm going to animate the random height of those buildings so that they're sort of fluctuating within my animation. Now you can animate anything. You could animate 2 scripts at once, changing an object. You can animate an object moving through the screen if you were to use the W key to move something around. And if Auto Keyframe is selected, it's going to remember that action across different keyframes. So we're just continuing this process of clicking, dragging, executing the script. I'm just keeping it very simple at first. I don't want to animate too many things at once. I want to keep it very logical and very intentional as to why I'm making motion the way I'm making motion. So for now, simply working by this one rule. Got it. And lastly at frame 100. Okay. Okay, so now that I've finished animating, I just want to make sure that auto keyframe is turned off so that I don't accidentally mess it up and move the scene, move the camera in some way, and then have that camera movement be keyframed. So we have video controls here. This play button allows me to see what's happened in those keyframes. I can also pause, stop, fast forward, just like the TV. And if at any point I don't, I think this motion is maybe too much, I can also go back in. Okay, so I'm just going to delete keyframes by either individually clicking on them and selecting them, or by drawing a window over them, selecting them. You notice that they're highlighted white, and then just hitting the delete key. Okay, so the original camera I created in my scene isn't pointing at the animation I just created. So why don't we just set up another camera in the scene that will capture that motion? Okay, so I'm just going to scale this plane a little bit bigger because I don't want anything floating around in the scene. May as well make it big. Alright, I'm doing that using the R key, the hot command, and now I'm holding my middle mouse button down and panning up on the screen just to find an angle I kind of like, because I'm going to do that same thing we did before. We're actually going to set the camera from the view. Okay, so I'm going back into Create and going down into Cameras, and I'm going to create a physical camera from the view. This will be my second camera in the scene. So now when I hit C, something a little bit different is going to happen. But I can also select that camera individually. I can rename physical camera 1 to the teapot camera so that I know, and that target as well changes names. And I can say physical camera 2, that's going to be my box camera. This way I know which camera is pointing at what. It's a little bit easier than remembering physical camera 1, physical camera 2. If I go back into cameras, I can now see that those have been renamed, and I can select them that way. Okay, so I have the box camera selected. I quickly use the P key to switch back into perspective view so that I don't change what I've set up with that camera. Alright, time to keep going. Okay, so now you remember I said if I hit C something different will happen. I hit C on my keyboard, and now it's instead of just switching to the one camera I have in the scene, it's actually asking me to select the camera within the scene. So I'm just going to select that box camera that we have and hit alright, and it should take me back to that box view. Before I do anything else, I really want to make sure that I'm switching to perspective for all editing and switching to camera mode for all viewing. Super important. Can't stress it enough. So hopefully that's helpful. You'll know when you do it. It's really frustrating. We've done a lot of work in the scene already, so just to be careful, I might save my file. Okay, so I'm just saving the file. I like to save several copies of my files just in case one gets corrupted or something happens. You never know. You always want to be able to go back because you might have spent an hour or two or even a couple days on a piece. It's not worth it to lose your work. Okay, for time's sake, you can go back to review how to create an object, but I've created a basic torus using it's a standard primitive in our object types by clicking and dragging that into the field of view. And I'm going to use the other scripts and just animate that torus really quickly, just to give you an example of how that works. Also, if you ever want to change colors, you can go into any object, select it, and there's a set library of stock colors that you can work with. So you just simply select the color, hit OK, and it changes that object's colors. Okay, I'm just going to select those boxes using my window selection, change the color there. Looks pretty good. And last but not least, let's change the color of that torus. Clicking on the color box, maybe orange is great. Okay, great. Okay, so I'm back at my scripts. I'm just opening up the random rotate script again. In my script editor, I'm just copying and pasting that back in, and we're going to rotate that torus around. So copying and pasting, similar setup to the way that the height script was set up. For the object and the money, I want you to do what's in the parentheses. And every time I hit Control E, it's actually changing the rotation of that object. Okay, so now I'm going to open up the random scale script, and I'm also going to copy and paste that into another line of max script. Now I have two scripts here working at once, so both scripts are going to operate on the object. So you see that as I hit Control E, it's both scaling and rotating that torus. Pretty useful if you're trying to animate something, some sort of twitchy motion. Maybe you find a script that helps you with that. Sometimes that speeds up your process, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's more helpful just to do it by hand. But say you have a script you like, just like scenes, you can save your scripts so that you can reuse them later. So I'm just going into my project folder that I set up at the very beginning of the tutorial, and I'm just going to save it as rotate scale scripts, and I'm going to save that as a max script file. Okay, awesome. Okay, so I've set up another camera called the Scene Overview camera. You can see that in my item dropdown. And these little teapots up here, these are the icons that we're going to use to sort of get everything ready to start rendering. So we want to set up, the teapot on the left is the render setup. And for now, we're just going to work with the scanline renderer. And then this teapot, this rendered frame window teapot, this is sort of our preview for what the animation frame is going to look like when we render it. So, pretty useful tool. Okay, so I've just clicked render, and it's shown me that camera view in the scene. All right there, so that's exactly what we wanted to happen. Going back to my render setup, this is containing all of the parameters for what we're working with in the animation. You see that I have, in my computer, I have iRay, Mental Ray, a Quicksilver renderer. 2018 also has some of these renders. They've replaced Mental Ray with a different renderer, and we're going to get into that more throughout the semester. But for now, scanline is totally fine. Okay, so I can output a single frame here. I can also, this is the common tab, by the way. This is all of the common settings for every frame in the animation. I can export, say, a range of frames from 0 to 100. I could also, change that and say I only have time for 50 frames. I can change that range to 50 and then go back in later and render frames 51 to 100. It's really helpful if you have a large file or a large animation and you don't have a ton of time, or maybe you need to render between different computers. Or I can render the active time segment. For us, that's fine. That's either that or the range will work fine because we have such a small file right now. And it's rendering the view. You can change the output size. Right now, 640 by 480 is totally fine. That's an aspect ratio of 1.333. If you're familiar with photography, this is where rendering can start to get really fun, because you can change different, you could set it up to render to the size of a film or a photo frame, to different resolutions. Really useful stuff, great for compositing, making sure your work looks seamless. For now, don't worry too much about it. We'll get into it. Okay, so let's scroll on down, and we want to place where our files are going to go. We want to establish a file path for that, so that when we save them or hit render, they're coming to our project folder. So if you've set your project folder correctly, this will be super easy. If not, it's also relatively easy to find where your folder is. So I'm just going to go down to Render Output, and I'm going to click on that Files button. Okay, so I clicked on Files. It's because I set up my project folder, it automatically positions me to save the file in my Render Output folder in 3ds Max. You can see that file path right there on the drop-down. Exactly where I set it. That's perfect. Okay, so now all I have to do is figure out a file name to call my animation and the type of file that I want to save it as. So I'm just going to call this MVP demo on 9/6/17. I'm going to save that as a PNG. Has great transparency features. It will make it easy for us when we import that into After Effects. Okay, so I just saved that. RGB 48 bits totally fine. Hit OK. And now you can see we're now saving the render output. You can see it right there. That's the file path. Okay, before we do anything else, I'm just going to save the scene again. I always like to save before I render. You never know what might happen. That's sort of the name of the game with animation. You never know what might happen. But especially with saving, just, save twice, worry less. Don't not save before you render because it might crash. Okay, so I'm just going to hit render. And you can see in my render preview, it's showing me every frame as it's rendering, along all those 100 frames along the timeline. Okay, awesome. So just closing out of both of those windows, closing out of 3ds itself, saving again, why not? Just get out of this and let's double check and make sure that those files are in our render output. So I'm going to go into my expansion drive, into Teaching, Fall 2017. This is my MVP demo and my render output. And yes, all of the files that we specified along that file path are now in this folder, and we're ready to take those into After Effects. All right, so After Effects, you don't have to be super familiar with it. It's I also need to fix my QuickTime. It's the main program that we're going to use to compile all of these stills that we've created in 3ds Max. So let's just start by creating a new composition. Okay, so I just click New Composition to start that. And it's going to bring up the composition settings. We really want these to match our animation from 3ds Max. So we want it to be both the same scale and the same frame rate so that those two sequences will render properly as an animation. There's a drop down with plenty of, these are different codecs, different resolutions for different types of media. 24 frames per second is a very common animation frame rate. 29.97 is very common for video. As you work throughout these different media, you get more familiar with it. But for now, let's try 1080, 24 frames a second. And I'm actually going to change the width and the height of my composition within After Effects to match the same size as my frames that I've exported from 3ds Max. So just to double check that, I'm going to look in my render output folder and get some info on this. So if I look at the bottom, it says that the dimensions are 640 by 480 pixels. So I'm just going to change that here within After Effects. 640 by 480. Square pixels is fine. And the start time code and the duration, that's going to be how long my timeline is in After Effects. You can also change the background color. For now though, I'm just going to keep it at black and hit OK. Okay, so once I hit OK, I'm brought into the basic workspace in After Effects. I can see on the left, I have my project. That MVP 097 is top left. My cursor right now is above the composition window. That's where my animation is going to be previewed. At the bottom, I have the timeline and where I can control some more things with my animation. So for now, I just want to import the files that we created in 3ds Max. I'm going to import them as a sequence. So instead of clicking multiple files, even though I know they are multiple files, I'm actually only going to select File. And I'll show you why in a minute. It'll just make life a little bit easier. Okay, so I select File, and then if you're using a Mac, there's other ways. It's a little bit different interface. But I'm just going to navigate for now to my project folder, to my render output. Again, if you're on a Mac and you don't see the large drop-down window, just click the Options tab. It should be in the bottom left. I'm going to select the first frame in my animation. It's important to select just the first frame so that After Effects recognizes that this is a PNG sequence. Okay? So I select that first frame, make sure that PNG sequence is checked so that it's read as one animation, and then I'm actually just going to import that as footage into After Effects. So I'm just going to say import. Okay. Okay, so now I have my composition as well as that PNG sequence. You see that my frame rates are a little bit different though. My sequence was actually at 30 frames per second and my composition's at 24. I can fix that pretty easily. At 30 frames per second, that puts my footage at 3 seconds and a little bit of change. My composition is currently 10 seconds. So I can either go into composition settings up here and change the settings themselves, change the duration of that animation in the timeline to 3, or 311 to match my footage. But I'm going to cancel that really quickly and actually go in and change the frame rate of my 3ds frames to match my composition. I want it to be 24 frames a second. As an animation, I think it'll work better. It's going to change the way that it's seen a little bit. So to do that, I need to change from 30 frames a second to 24. I just need to go down here into my interpret footage window. It's the little computer icon next to the folder. And make sure that's selected. Click interpret footage. And I'm now going to make my files assume the frame rate of 24 frames per second. Just hit enter because I don't think I can scroll down that far, but there's an OK at the bottom. For now though, I'm just gonna hit enter. Square pixels is great, and okay, great. So now both my composition and my sequence are 30 frames a second. I've actually just dragged that PNG sequence directly into the timeline. Okay, so I can just hit the spacebar to start playing and previewing. It's really a RAM preview of that animation. It's moving a little bit slower than it would as a rendered animation. That's because it's using the memory of my computer to really hustle and give me a preview for that. I could also preview, using the start and stop button right up here. I can stop, control the animation that way. So I'm just going to save my After Effects project. That way I can always go back. Maybe I want to edit things, add some effects. I'm saving them to my project folder. Okay, so I'm just saving it as MVP on September 6th. And you see this little icon here, the render queue. I just want to render my animation now as a movie so I can share it with the world. My computer, the settings are a little bit different, but if you look on your handout for the assignment, you'll be able to find the correct render settings. And the render queue is actually the same visually, so just make sure to change the settings a bit. I'm going to need to use an AVI because QuickTime's been corrupted on my computer and it's going to be fixed, but we're going to be exporting QuickTime movies for the class. Okay, so to render, we're going to go down to File, and we're going to do Export, Add to Render Queue. And what that does is it places our movie within the render queue. And now we're ready to prep this for the final export. Okay, so I'm just going to click on best settings here. They're great. Keep the render settings as best settings. For the output module, we're going to change lossless. We're going to change that to a QuickTime movie for you. Make sure the audio output is off. Okay, so changing it to QuickTime. Format options. I can't do it because of my computer, but I'm just going to type them out on the screen for you. Okay, so now I'm just going to make sure that it's outputting to where I need it to be, and just hit render. It renders my animation quickly, and I'm not going to save that. Now you see this is the animation that we've just created. So I hope that this has been helpful. I'm going to try to continue to do some video demos for us throughout the class. For a written description of what we've done today, and for some more information on the project that's due for Monday, check out the handout that's up on Canvas. There's a link to it in the assignment itself. It's also in the Canvas files. All of the scripts that we use today are within the Canvas files. And you can always just, reach out to me via email, and I'd be more than happy to set up a time to meet, or I can get back to you as soon as possible. But otherwise, have a great weekend, and I'm really looking forward to seeing the work that you produced for Monday. So 100 frames, make it fun, no sounds, and export as a QuickTime movie. All right, have a good weekend. Thanks.